It was supposed to be a routine training exercise. Nothing out of the ordinary, just me and my team of highly trained canine German Shepherds, navigating the frozen labyrinth of Wyoming's Bitter Creek National Reserve. The air was already biting when we started, but none of us could have predicted what was coming. Within minutes, an unforgiving blizzard descended upon us like a vengeful spirit, swallowing everything in its path. Visibility dropped to zero as icy winds howled through the skeletal trees, clawing at our skin and freezing our breaths midair. My handler, Rachel Vance, shouted something over the storm, but her voice was lost in the chaos. Before I could react, the dogs veered off course, their instincts overriding commands, leaving me behind in the suffocating white void. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, heart pounding against the cold grip of panic. Each second stretched into hours as the temperature plummeted further, threatening to turn even the strongest willpower into brittle ice. I called out for them, my voice hoarse and swallowed by the wind, but they were gone, disappeared into the abyss without a trace. At that moment, doubt crept into my mind. Had I failed them? Were they lost forever? But deep down, I knew better. These weren't ordinary dogs. They were warriors, soldiers bred for resilience and loyalty. They wouldn't abandon their mission, not now, not ever. As the storm raged on, I realized something profound. It wasn't just about finding them anymore. Somewhere in this merciless wilderness, life hung by a thread, and it wasn't just mine or theirs. Against all odds, those dogs had sensed something they couldn't see. Their sharp noses, honed from years of training, had detected a faint whisper of survival buried beneath layers of snow and despair. With every step they took away from me, they drew closer to uncovering a truth far greater than any of us could have imagined. Little did I know, their discovery would change lives, including mine, forever. The moment the chains clamped around Thomas Grady's wrists, he knew this wasn't just an act of intimidation, it was a death sentence. The men who had ambushed him weren't amateurs. They were professionals, masked and methodical, their voices cold as the steel biting into his skin. "You should have stayed out of it," one of them growled before delivering a brutal blow to his temple. Blood trickled down his face, mingling with the icy wind that howled through the trees. They dragged him deeper into the forest, far beyond any trail or patrol route, until they reached a gnarled pine tree at the edge of oblivion. There, they chained him like an animal, hands bound behind his back, chest pressed against the frozen bark, and left him to die. For 2 days, Thomas fought not just the chains, but the elements themselves. Each breath felt like shards of glass slicing through his lungs, the freezing air stealing what little warmth remained in his body. His head throbbed from the wound on his temple, blood crusting over his frostbitten cheek. Every movement sent fresh waves of agony through his raw wrists, where the metal chains had already worn away layers of skin. Hunger clawed at his stomach, and exhaustion clouded his mind. Yet the worst torment came from the silence, the oppressive, suffocating quiet of the wilderness. He could hear nothing but the wind and the occasional snap of distant branches, sounds that only reminded him how alone he was. But Thomas Grady wasn't a man who gave up easily. Even as his body betrayed him, his spirit refused to surrender. He thought of Valor, the scarred German shepherd he'd seen leading searches during training exercises. Would anyone even realize he was missing? Or would the storm erase all traces of him, leaving him to become another forgotten casualty of the forest? As the hours dragged on, hope seemed as fleeting as the snowflakes melting on his lips. Yet deep down, something stirred within him, a flicker of defiance. If these criminals thought they could silence him so easily, they underestimated the resilience of a man who had spent decades protecting this land. On the second night, as the temperature plummeted further, Thomas began to hallucinate. Shadows moved between the trees, faces appeared in the darkness, and the sound of footsteps echoed in his ears. Was it rescue, or was it death coming for him? Just when despair threatened to consume him entirely, a faint rustling broke through the stillness. At first, he thought it was wolves, drawn by the scent of blood. But then he saw them shapes moving low and deliberate, their golden eyes piercing the gloom. It was the K9 unit, led by Valor. For the first time in days, Thomas allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't going to die after all. The moment the K9 unit caught the faint scent of blood on the icy wind, something primal ignited within them. Valor, the alpha dog with a scar over his left eye, was the first to react. His golden eyes narrowed as he logged onto the source, a man chained to a tree, barely clinging to life. The sight of Thomas Grady, battered and frozen, struck a chord deep within Valor. It wasn't just instinct driving him, it was something more profound, almost human. Without hesitation, Valor sprang into action, his powerful jaws clamping down on the cold metal chains binding Thomas. He pulled with every ounce of strength, his muscles rippling beneath his thick coat, but the chains held firm. Still, he refused to give up. Each tug sent tremors through the tree, shaking loose chunks of ice that cascaded to the ground like shards of broken glass. Meanwhile, another German shepherd in the pack began digging furiously at the base of the tree, its paws clawing through layers of hardened snow. The team worked with military precision, their movements synchronized as if they had rehearsed this exact scenario countless times. One by one, the other dogs fanned out, forming a protective perimeter around Thomas while keeping watch for any signs of danger. The sharp ears twitched at every distant sound, the crack of branches, the howl of the wind, but nothing distracted them from their mission. As Valor continued gnawing at the chains, his teeth scraped against the steel, creating an eerie metallic echo that reverberated through the silent forest. Blood began to seep from his gums, yet he pressed on, undeterred. Another dog joined him, using its nose to nudge at the padlock securing the chains. Its breath came in short, frosty bursts, visible even in the dim light. Together, they uncovered the lock buried beneath the snow, revealing a glimmer of hope amidst the despair. Thomas, drifting in and out of consciousness, could feel the vibrations of their efforts. Through swollen eyelids, he saw the determined faces of the dogs, their eyes gleaming with unwavering resolve. "Good boys," he whispered hoarsely, his voice barely audible over the storm. Valor paused for a brief second, his head tilting slightly as if acknowledging the words, before resuming his relentless assault on the chains. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, each second heavier than the last. Just when it felt like all hope was lost, one of the dogs let out a sharp bark, alerting the others to a distant figure approaching through the trees. Valor raised his head, his ears perked, and released a low growl, a warning to whoever dared come near. But then, a familiar voice called out, cutting through the chaos. It was Rachel Vance, her voice urgent but filled with relief. "I see him. Over here," she shouted, rushing toward them with a flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. For the first time in days, Thomas allowed himself to believe that survival might still be possible. As Thomas Grady teetered on the edge of unconsciousness, his vision blurred with tears and frostbite, he saw Valor staring at him. The dog's golden eyes burned with a fierce determination that seemed almost otherworldly. It wasn't just loyalty in those eyes, it was resolve, a promise that Valor would not let him die. Thomas had seen valor in soldiers and rangers who braved wildfires, but never before had he witnessed such raw, unyielding devotion as what radiated from this scarred German shepherd. Valor's gaze locked onto his like an anchor, pulling him back from the abyss of despair. But even as their connection deepened, Thomas could feel his body shutting down piece by piece. His fingers were numb, his chest burned with every labored breath, and the cold gnawed at his very soul. The rescue team arrived moments later, their shouts slicing through the howling wind. Rachel Vance led them, her voice urgent yet steady as she directed the others to dig through the snow around Thomas. They worked tirelessly, prying open the chains with tools that clanged against the frozen metal. Each second felt like an eternity for Thomas, who was now slipping in and out of awareness. He could hear faint voices. "Hold on." Someone yelled, but they sounded distant, muffled by the storm raging both outside and within him. When they finally freed him, lifting him gently onto the stretcher, Thomas summoned every ounce of strength left in his battered body to reach out to Valor. His trembling hand hovered inches away from the dog's thick fur, but it was too late. His muscles betrayed him, collapsing under the weight of exhaustion. Tears streamed down his face, freezing on his cheeks, as he realized how close he had come to leaving Valor behind. Valor, ever steadfast, pressed his nose against Thomas's outstretched palm, breathing warmth into his icy skin. For a brief moment, time seemed to stop. The storm still roared around them, but all Thomas could see was Valor, the silent warrior who refused to abandon him. Rachel crouched beside him, shielding him from the biting wind as the medics prepared to move him. "You're going to be okay," she said firmly, though her voice cracked with emotion. Thomas wanted to respond, to thank her, to tell Valor how much he meant to him, but no words came. Instead, he closed his eyes, letting the sound of Valor's steady breathing fill his ears. As the stretcher began to move, Valor followed, his paws crunching softly in the snow. Despite everything, despite the pain and the betrayal and the near-death experience, one thought echoed in Thomas's mind: he saved me. When Thomas Grady finally regained full consciousness, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, but what he uncovered shook him to his core. The attack on him wasn't random. It was calculated, part of a vast and insidious criminal network that stretched far beyond illegal logging or poaching. As Rachel Vance laid out the evidence before him, forged permits, falsified reports, and intercepted communications, it became clear that this operation had been running for years under their noses. What started as suspicions about land exploitation quickly spiraled into something darker: weapons smuggling, black market timber trades, and even rumors of ties to organized crime syndicates operating across state lines. But the most devastating revelation came when Rachel slid a folder across the table. Inside were documents revealing internal corruption within the Ranger ranks. Someone high up in the chain of command had been signing off on these operations, ensuring they remained hidden from scrutiny. "Dalton," Thomas whispered, his voice hollow with disbelief. It wasn't just negligence, it was betrayal. Sheriff Dalton, the man who had sworn an oath to protect the reserve, was at the center of it all. He hadn't acted alone, but his role as the orchestrator made the wound cut deeper. Thomas clenched his fists, anger simmering beneath the surface. "He left me to die like an animal," he muttered through gritted teeth. "All because I wouldn't look the other way." Rachel placed a hand on his shoulder, her expression grim. "It's not just you, Thomas. This goes beyond one person. These people don't care about laws or lives, they care about profit." Her words hung heavy in the air, a chilling reminder of how deep greed could rot even the noblest institutions. Valor, ever vigilant, sat by Thomas's side, his golden eyes fixed on the door as if sensing the lingering threat outside. His presence was a small comfort, but it couldn't erase the weight of what Thomas now knew. Dalton hadn't merely abandoned him, he had sold out the entire Ranger force, turning a blind eye to crimes that destroyed both the forest and its protectors. And yet, Valor's unwavering loyalty stood in stark contrast to the treachery unfolding around them. As Thomas stared at the scarred dog, a new resolve hardened within him. If Dalton thought this was the endgame, he was wrong. With Valor by his side and Rachel leading the investigation, Thomas vowed to dismantle the web of deceit piece by piece. But deep down, He couldn't shake the feeling that uncovering the truth would come at a cost one far greater than anyone anticipated. The confrontation unfolded under the pale glow of a single overhead light in the ranger station's cold interrogation room. Thomas Grady stood across from Sheriff Dalton, his fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The silence between them was suffocating, broken only by the faint hum of the generator outside. Valor sat at Thomas's side, his golden eyes locked onto Dalton with an intensity that made the sheriff visibly uneasy. "You sold me out," Thomas finally said, his voice low but trembling with rage. "For what? Money? Power?" Dalton didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his rugged face etched with lines of exhaustion and guilt, or perhaps it was just shameless indifference. When he finally spoke, his words were slow, deliberate, as if trying to justify his betrayal. "It wasn't personal, Grady. They wanted access land for hunting, logging, whatever they could squeeze out of this place. I gave them permits, fake ones, sure, but enough to keep them quiet. You wouldn't stop digging. You wouldn't let it go." His voice hardened, the calm facade cracking. "I thought leaving you out there would make you disappear. No body, no evidence. Simple." Thomas felt the bile rise in his throat. He had trusted Dalton not just as a colleague, but as a friend. For years, they had worked side by side, shared meals around campfires, and fought wildfires together. And now, this man had left him to die like an animal. "You chained me to a tree in the middle of a blizzard," Thomas spat, taking a step forward. Valor growled low, a warning rumble that echoed through the room. "You thought I'd freeze to death, that no one would ever find me?" Dalton flinched, glancing at Valor before quickly averting his gaze. "That storm, it was supposed to bury you. Permanently." His voice faltered, and for a moment he looked almost human. "But I didn't count on that damn dog. I didn't think anyone or anything would find you." Thomas felt the weight of those words settle over him like a shroud. Valor hadn't just saved his life. He had exposed the rot at the heart of everything Thomas had believed in. The scarred German shepherd rose to his feet, stepping closer to Dalton, his teeth bared in a silent threat. "Valor found me when you abandoned me," Thomas said, his voice breaking. "He brought help when you left me to die. And now, because of him, the truth is coming out." Dalton's expression shifted from fear to desperation. "Look, you can walk away from this. Take the dog, retire early, and let this whole mess fade away. No one needs to know what I did." But Thomas shook his head, his resolve unshakable. "You betrayed your oath. You betrayed me. And I won't let you destroy this forest or the people who protect it." The arrest of Sheriff Dalton should have been the end of it, a triumphant conclusion to weeks of betrayal and danger. But for Thomas Grady, the uneasy feeling in his gut never fully subsided. The forest seemed quieter than usual, almost as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something darker to emerge. Valor, too, had grown restless, pacing the edges of the ranger station with an intensity that suggested he sensed trouble long before anyone else did. Then, one night during a routine patrol on the outskirts of Sector 9, the storm they had all feared finally broke. Thomas and Valor were alone, their boots crunching softly against the fresh snow. The air was brittle, carrying the faint scent of pine and smoke from distant cabins. It was supposed to be a quiet evening, just another sweep through abandoned trails, but then the world shifted. A metallic clink echoed through the trees, sharp and deliberate. Valor froze, his ears perked high, muscles coiled like springs ready to strike. "What is it, boy?" Thomas whispered, his hand instinctively reaching for his sidearm. Before Valor could respond, a figure darted between the shadows, moving with calculated precision. "Show yourself," Thomas shouted, his voice slicing through the stillness. There was no reply, only the whisper of wind weaving through the pines. And then, without warning, a shot rang out, a deafening crack that shattered the fragile peace of the wilderness. Time slowed as Thomas turned toward the sound, his heart stopping when he saw Valor collapse onto the snow, blood pooling beneath him. "No!" Thomas screamed, dropping to his knees beside the injured dog. Valor whimpered faintly, his golden eyes locking onto Thomas's face, filled with pain but also trust and unspoken promise that he wasn't giving up. From the darkness stepped Mark Howie, a young deputy who had once been part of Dalton's inner circle. His face was cold, devoid of remorse as he leveled his gun at Thomas. "You think locking up Dalton fixed anything? He was just a pawn. I'm the one pulling the strings now." Thomas clenched his fists, rage boiling inside him. "You shot him. You shot my dog," he growled, his voice trembling with fury. Mark smirked, unfazed. "That might cost us everything. Guess I owed him one." Rachel arrived moments later, her presence shifting the balance. With quick, decisive movements, she disarmed Mark and cuffed him, but the damage was done. As Thomas cradled Valor in his arms, tears streaming down his face, he vowed silently that this wouldn't be the end, not for them, not for justice. Valor's shallow breathing was the only sound in the frozen silence, a reminder of how close they had come to losing everything. The veterinary unit at the State Canine Center was eerily quiet as Thomas Grady paced outside the operating room, his hands trembling with a mix of anger and fear. The bullet had struck Valor just above his left leg, but it wasn't the wound itself that terrified him. It was how close it had come to ending everything. Inches. That's all that separated them from losing the one creature who had never abandoned him. "He's strong," Rachel Vance said softly, her voice breaking through his spiraling thoughts. "Valor doesn't give up." But even she couldn't mask the worry in her eyes as doctors worked tirelessly behind closed doors. Hours passed like days, each tick of the clock amplifying Thomas's dread. He replayed the moment over and over in his mind, the sharp crack of gunfire, Valor collapsing into the snow, his warm blood seeping through Thomas's fingers as he pressed down on the wound. "You saved me once," Thomas whispered under his breath, staring at the sterile white walls of the hospital corridor. "Don't leave now. Not after everything." Finally, a doctor emerged, his face unreadable. For a split second, Thomas felt his heart stop. Then the man nodded. "He'll pull through," he said, relief washing over his tired features. The bullet missed his vital organs by centimeters. "It's going to be a long recovery, but he's tough." Thomas exhaled sharply, tears stinging his eyes. He wanted to thank the doctor, to say something meaningful, but no words came. Instead, he simply asked, "Can I see him?" When they led him into the recovery room, Thomas froze. Valor lay there, bandaged and fragile, yet alive. His breathing was shallow, his golden eyes half closed, but as Thomas approached, something miraculous happened. Valor opened his eyes fully, locking onto Thomas's gaze with an intensity that defied his weakened state. Slowly, deliberately, he wagged his tail, a small movement, barely noticeable, but enough to shatter whatever composure Thomas had left. Tears streamed down his face as he sank to his knees beside the dog's bed. "You came back for me again," Thomas choked out, his voice cracking. "Why do you keep saving me?" Valor didn't answer, not with words, but his steady gaze spoke volumes. It was gratitude, trust, and loyalty wrapped into one silent promise: "I will always be here." Thomas buried his face in his hands, sobbing openly now. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about connection, about the unbreakable bond between a man and his dog forged in fire and ice. For the first time since the nightmare began, Thomas allowed himself to hope. Valor had survived the storm, the chains, the betrayal, and now this. Together, they would heal, fight, and protect what mattered most. As the dog let out a soft whine, Thomas reached out, placing a hand gently on Valor's chest. "We're not done yet, partner," he murmured. "Not even close." Weeks after Valor's recovery, the scars of betrayal still lingered in the air, but Thomas Grady refused to let bitterness define him or the forest he had sworn to protect. With Rachel Vance by his side, they began rebuilding what Dalton and his network of corruption had nearly destroyed. Together, they formed a new patrol unit unlike any other, Echo K9 Task Force. It wasn't just a name. It was a promise, a vow to safeguard not only the land, but also the integrity of those who served it. The team was small at first, handpicked from trusted rangers and handlers, each one vetted rigorously to ensure there would be no repeat of past betrayals. At its heart stood Thomas and Valor, inseparable partners bound by more than duty. They were united by survival, trust, and an unbreakable bond forged in fire and ice. Valor, now older and slightly slower, carried himself with a quiet dignity that commanded respect. His scarred coat gleamed under the Wyoming sun, and his golden eyes remained as sharp as ever, scanning the horizon for danger. He became more than a working dog. He became a symbol. To the Rangers, he represented resilience. To the public, he embodied loyalty. Stories of how he had saved Thomas spread far beyond the borders of Wyoming, reaching news outlets nationwide. Reporters flocked to interview them, cameras rolling as Valor sat calmly beside Thomas, his presence speaking louder than words ever could. "He doesn't just work with me," Thomas told one journalist, his voice thick with emotion. "He fights for me, for all of us." Every morning, Thomas and Valor set out together, their footprints marking fresh trails through the wilderness. They patrolled areas once deemed unsafe, dismantling illegal traps, confiscating poached goods, and confronting criminals bold enough to return. Each step they took felt like reclaiming stolen ground, restoring balance to a place that had been exploited for far too long. Rachel often joined them, her leadership ensuring the unit operated with precision and purpose. "We're not just stopping crime," she reminded the team during briefings. "We're protecting something bigger than ourselves." But Valor's legacy extended beyond patrols and arrests. Schools invited Thomas and Valor to speak about their story, inspiring children and adults alike with tales of courage and unwavering partnership. Children would gather around Valor, awestruck by the hero who had faced bullets and storms without hesitation. For Thomas, these moments were bittersweet. Valor wasn't just a dog, he was family. And every time someone thanked him or praised Valor, Thomas felt a surge of pride mixed with humility. As the months passed, the forest seemed to breathe easier under their watchful eyes. The trees stood taller, the rivers flowed clearer, and the wildlife thrived once again. But above all, the spirit of loyalty lived on not just in Valor, but in everyone who followed in their footsteps. As Thomas Grady stood on the edge of the forest, watching Valor lead yet another patrol through the towering pines, he couldn't help but reflect on how far they'd come. The scars of betrayal still lingered, the memory of Dalton's cold eyes, Mark Howie's cruel smirk, and the blood staining the snow where Valor had fallen, but they had turned those wounds into something greater, a legacy of courage and unwavering loyalty. "True bravery doesn't wear a cape," Thomas whispered to himself, his voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. "It walks on four legs, fights without hesitation, and never leaves your side when you need it most." Valor paused mid-step, turning his golden gaze back toward Thomas as if understanding every word. In that moment, Thomas realized the story wasn't just theirs anymore. It belonged to everyone who believed in the power of trust, resilience, and second chances. He thought about all the people who doubted them, who underestimated the bond between a man and his dog. Yet here they were, defying odds, protecting what mattered, and proving that even in the darkest storms, light could break through. The author's message is clear. Faith and loyalty isn't naive. It's necessary. It's the thread that holds us together when everything else unravels. For Thomas, valor wasn't just a partner, he was salvation wrapped in fur and scars. And for anyone listening, the lesson is universal. Sometimes the smallest allies become our greatest heroes. As Thomas knelt to scratch behind Valor's ears, he looked up at the horizon, where sunlight pierced through the trees. "Never stop believing," he said softly, speaking not just to Valor, but to anyone who needed hope.